All right, Eight Dimensions of Mind, episode 5. We're going to do a deep dive on the first dimension, terror, connection, and security. So we're going to start out here with this developmental stage overview that I went into in pretty good detail last time. Just to recap here, or actually what I want to show is that here under state, I have added another component. So on the state of the infant, kind of the negative state of being in physical dimension of mind is terror, like life-threatening terror. And when we move on to the emotional state of mind, which we'll discuss, dimension of mind, which we'll discuss next episode, it asks, am I okay? And the negative, I am not okay, is kind of a shame, a diminishment of self, shame being kind of a diminishment of self. And the opposite of that, or maybe not the opposite, but kind of a counter to that, is that when folks tend to get diminished, some folks will kind of inflate themselves up in a self-aggrandizing way. And that's what I'm calling ego. So kind of ego as a response to shame, which is a negative dimension of the second dimension, emotional intelligence or emotional state of dimension of mind. Moving on to the third state there, the conceptual dimension of mind. One example of how that plays out is psychological projection. So there's a sort of a self-concept that starts building in this preschool stage. And to the extent we're not owning all of ourselves and who we are, we tend to project that onto others. And moving on to the fourth dimension of mind, the social state of mind. What happens there is often what we would call judgment. So one way we can unpack this and look at this is, let's say I have a judgment about a certain person, meaning I judge them to be good or bad, maybe positive judgment. It could be a negative judgment. Often when you unpack that judgment, you'll find a projection. So if I say Bill Gates is evil, that's my judgment. And if you unpack the judgment and move down to the projection, it's that I haven't come to terms with the evil within myself. So I project that onto someone else, Bill Gates. And now what's underneath that projection? There could be some emotional dysregulation to come into touch with my own evil qualities is not okay. It makes me a bad person. So I kind of go into a shame space. So there's this layered approach that I'm talking about. I'll get into that more at the end of this series here on the lower 4 dimensions, but I just wanted to kind of throw that in there. Particularly today, we're talking about the first dimension. So we're talking about terror, life-threatening terror. Where there's the second state, emotional dimension of mind, is more about, can mean more about threatening to my person. The first dimension is life-threatening to my physical state of being. Anyhow, let's move on. Okay. So where does that start? So we're talking about physical intelligence or physical consciousness or a physical dimension of mind. We're not talking about physical talent or skill here. This is not about athletics or performance or physical expression so much in that way. Likewise, it's not about what I would call some of like the physical necessities that are good to get in order for a better balanced life, meaning sleep, diet, exercise, and meditation. Those are all things that kind of help our physical and mental state of being, but we're not really talking about that. Leary and Wilson were Used a lot of different names for a lot of these different circuits, but pretty commonly just landed on biosurvival as a state of mind here in this first dimension, meaning is the world okay? And again, we're talking about life-threatening terror versus safety and security. So we get into this, and most of the discussion that I've seen around this topic in the past is often goes to, is this a real threat or a perceived threat? And generally, most of us, if you're reading this message, you probably are fairly physically secure. You're not in a war zone or a third world country where you're under threat of starvation or persecution. So most of us, we could say, don't necessarily deal with a lot of real threats except under extreme circumstances. And therefore, the thought is these are all perceived threats and that we should be able to come to a conscious realization that these are perceived threats and just kind of move on with their life, so to speak. But I don't really think that's the way it works. And I think the way it works is really most fabulously summarized in this quote here by Gabor Mate. Safety is not the absence of threat. It is the presence of connection. So I'm going to get into that. And that is, again, when I talk about creating a relational approach to this 8-circuit model, that's what I'm talking about. That it really, the relationship here is connecting to other people in order to feel safe and secure. So I will get into that a little further as we move along here. I'm going to start out with the neuroscience and talk about the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is part of the limbic system. So right away, we might say, well, that really fits with what we're calling the second dimension. And I would say, as we unpack this, we're going to see that the amygdala is really the smoke detector, which assesses threat and challenge. Should we do something about that? But it looks at a sense of safety from both a first dimension physical aspect and a second dimension emotional aspect. And in fact, when we look at the 4 different functions of the amygdala, right there, number 1, sense of safety. Am I physically and emotionally safe in this moment? Another thing the amygdala looks at is congruence in the environment when assessing threat and trust. Now, what does that mean? Does the information on my radar add up? So if they're in a relationship with another person, often, you know, we say one thing, but we really mean another. And what I mean by that is our body language might often be giving a different signal than what we're saying. So somebody might ask me a question and I might give them the answer, but then I might shrug my shoulders and say, I don't know. So it may sound like I have got the answer using the words that are spoken, but at the same time, my body language with my shoulder shrugs is saying, well, I don't really know. I'm just kind of winging it. And the amygdala picks up on that incongruence between the body language versus the words that are being said. And body language can also mean tone of voice and porosity, prosody, just the way the words are being said, you know, how they're being said. Is that congruent with the words that are actually being said? Third thing, just certainty versus uncertainty. The unknown is what's in front of me, what I'm perceiving, something familiar, or is this something new and uncertain, which makes me uncomfortable? And therefore, there is more of an air of threat there. And then fourth is the shoulds. And when I say both external and internal, I mean the shoulds that are placed upon you by the outside world. You should do this, you should do that. And the shoulds that we place on ourselves, usually by internalizing the external world shoulds and then telling ourselves, well, I should do this and should do that. The shoulds are often an example of how we're taking in what other people or culture and society say we should do versus what we really authentically feel. And when those are not congruent, which is often the case with the shoulds, how I really want to show up versus how I believe the world wants me to show up, or how I believe I should show up, that incongruence the amygdala will perceive as a threat, which is interesting because a lot of us live in this incongruence between our words and our body language, or in this incongruence between what we should do and what we really ought to do, or want to do, I should say. And so what I'm saying there is that a lot of us kind of live in a world that is incongruent and therefore threatening. And the amygdala is picking up on that. And sometimes we're just living in this low-level chronic emergency, in part by the amygdala saying, hey, things here aren't necessarily adding up. There's some incongruence. Now, the amygdala is a kind of a concrete structure in the limbic system. We know that it develops and turns on and has what we neuroscientists call a critical window of activation in the third trimester of the womb, in the womb. So during pregnancy is when the amygdala turns on and activates and takes its imprint. So this is before birth, obviously. You know, in the traditional 8-circuit model, we would say that the first circuit imprint is taken with birth. And surely the process of birth is a very powerful event that I'm sure has a huge impact on this process of all kinds of things, but first dimension safety in this case is what we're talking about. And when we use the amygdala as an example of the first dimension, we see that this actually takes its imprint from its environment while we're babies in the womb. So so there's that. Next thing I want to talk about is Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory. Now, this is one of the more unique and exciting discoveries or breakthroughs in the neuroscientific field in the last several years. And it really is shattering this old paradigm that we used to carry around rest and digest versus fight or flight. It used to be this very binary. We're either resting and digesting or in fight or flight. And what we found is that's not really the case. In this rest and digest scenario, the scientists found sort of two different states of beings. And so what they did is started to look at that a little deeper, and we found out that the rest and digest was associated with the vagal nerve, the vagus nerve, while fight or flight is associated with the sympathetic nervous system. And the scientists found that there was actually two vagal pathways. There's a very old, and I mean evolutionarily old, dorsal vagal system, which is kind of a primitive nervous system. It's unmyelinated, it's very slow, and that regulates freeze, or what we might call shutdown. And then we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight, and then a more recently evolved ventral vagal system, which basically has to deal with emotional regulation, self-regulation, but for our purposes, what I want to talk about is emotional regulation through social connection. So we've basically split that out to three pathways. And really what we're looking at is that one of them usually takes dominance. You know, they're all three are being used at any given time, but one of them will step in the forefront and take dominance. Now, right away, as a side note, I want to say that I'm presenting all this model in the lower four circuits from a heavily developmental perspective. And some folks like to look at evolutionary psychology and evolution as to show a progression of development of the circuits or the dimensions. And here we find something that I would say fits squarely in the first dimension, but it has an evolutionary development, meaning I'm not going to place the ventral vagal system in the second, third, or fourth dimension. To me, even though it's more recently evolved, that doesn't mean it gets status in one of the upper or higher circuits, so to speak, that it really, all this fits into the first dimension, but we can see how the first dimension has evolved over time from just a freeze and shutdown response, which you might find in, hell, I don't know where you find it evolutionary, but way back, primitive animals are going to have this freeze and shutdown response. But then more developed animals have a fight or flight system. And then what you find in human beings is that we have a very well-developed ventral vagal emotional regulation system that works through social connection and develops through social connection. Now, if I allow myself to be regulated emotionally by another person through the ventral vagus, and when I say emotional regulation, I'm saying the regulation of threat and fear, really, that kind of regulation. But it allows me to do that through connection with another person. But the idea is that as I continue to do that and I continue to develop, as I allow myself to be regulated by another person, I am in the back of my mind learning how to self-regulate fear and threat in this example. And there I'm internalizing this regulation process by allowing myself to be regulated through connection. So it's not like we're fostering this permanent dependence on other people. The idea is that we develop self-regulation by allowing ourselves to be regulated by another. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in the second dimension, but I just really want to point that out as well. Now, the best way to think about this polyvagal theory is through a model that was developed by Dan Siegel and I believe it was developed by Dan Siegel and then named by Pat Ogden. I think that's how it goes, but it's called the window of tolerance. It looks like this. Here in the middle, as you can see, there's this is what we would call the ventral vagal system in this window of tolerance. We're grounded, we're flexible, open and curious, present, and able to, on this slide, it says able to emotionally self-regulate or able to connect within the social system and then be regulated, allow ourselves to be regulated by another. And what happens is as we get more and more emotions or fear flooding the system, we start to move into hyperarousal. We start to get above this little dash line into the red zone there. And that's the area of energy, anxiety, anger, overwhelm, hypervigilance, fight or flight. And as that, we may proceed higher and higher into this zone of hyperarousal until we become just so overwhelmed that the system just has to shut down and we drop into hypoarousal, which is the dorsal vagal system, the primitive shutdown and freeze response. And so there's a shutdown, numbing, depression, passive, withdrawn, freeze. This dorsal vagal is really connected to the gut. And so people with a lot of gut problems or IBS and things like that can be suffering from chronic hypoarousal. But here within this model, you can see the relationship between anxiety and depression. In the middle here, in the window of tolerance, we're regulated, and then we start to experience anxiety. And then when our experience of anxiety becomes so much that we just can't manage anymore, we shut down and move into depression. Now, maybe we recover from our depression and that moves back into hyperarousal anxiety. And you often see folks that suffer from both anxiety and depression, and they're moving from the fight or flight sympathetic nervous system state of hyperarousal into the dorsal vagal depressed state of hypoarousal. And really what we want to do is get them into a ventral vagal state of present and curious and self-regulated. And more so as we do developmental work, what we're looking to do really is expand this window of tolerance, expand our capacity to co-regulate and with another and self-regulate. So that's this applies both to the first dimension terror and fear, but also second dimension emotions, which we'll get into next episode. And then moving on here, the last thing I want to really cover about biosurvival, physical intelligence or dimension of mind is attachment theory, which really comes down to how do you regulate threat and create safety? How do you connect to regulate threat and safety? So the infant asks, is the world okay? And it turns out for an infant that an infant would look to mom. Mom is like their representation of the environment and the world, and is like, mom is giving us cues. Is the world okay or not? So if we feel safe with mom, we're going to feel safe. If we feel unsafe with mom, that's going to lead to other problems, sort of a negative imprint, you might say, or a negative, imprint. And within the attachment world, there's 4 strategies. There's a secure attachment, anxious avoidant, anxious ambivalent, and disorganized. And there was a whole experiment done called the Strange Situation with Mary Main that was done, years and years, probably I think in the 50s. And you can look that up and that'll kind of help explain the model of attachment theory. But the way I like to think about it is this. Sooner or later, the infant starts to crawl and it crawls away from mother. And if you've ever seen an infant do this, when they first start crawling, they often kind of look back at their mom, they're checking them out and they're saying, is this okay? Am I okay? Which is kind of that second dimension question. And you can see what kind of attachment strategy is going on just based on the mother's response. So an infant-mother relationship that has a secure attachment, you'll see the mom like, yeah, go on, you're okay, go ahead and crawl. Secure attachment. Now, an anxious avoidant mother-child relationship, you might see the mom be worried, like the infant starts to crawl away and the mom is distressed, like, oh my God, be careful. And that's like, it's not safe in the world, be careful. A third reaction might be this anxious ambivalent is kind of like when the infant looks back to mom saying, is this cool? What's up? And the mom's on her phone. She's not even paying attention. So there's this kind of ambivalence and the infant just, like, oh, mom's not there for me. I'm on my own. Meanwhile, the fourth strategy might be a disorganized relationship between mother and child, infant, to where mom looks back, or I'm sorry, the infant looks back to mom and mom gives mixed messages, which might be something like, yeah, go. Oh, I'm not so sure about, yeah, I want you to go, but I'm scared. So there's this kind of mixed message thing, this disorganized message. And that usually is what we would call a traumatic situation. And the baby doesn't know what's up and kind of takes on this complex PTSD trauma response of disorganized attachment. I don't know if the world's safe or not. I'm really confused and I can't figure things out. And then the next thing I want to talk about here, when we talk about this, is attachment theory is really discussing the good enough mother, meaning that in order to create a secure attachment between, well, I'm saying the infant and mom, but what we say is that there's not always a mom or your biological mom. So they talk about the primary caregiver. Obviously, when you're in the womb, it's mom, but then once you leave the womb, you might not be dealing with mom, you might be dealing with a primary caregiver. But I'm using mom or mother. And the good enough mother theory says that in order to obtain secure attachment, you really only have to be present and connect with your child during times of distress about 30% of the time. So it kind of dispels this notion that you have to be a perfect mother or perfect caregiver and always be there and ready to jump in when the infant cries out, reaches out and cries, usually is how they reach out and ask for help. So just want to mention that when you start talking about couples relationships and creating a secure bond, a secure attachment between a couple, it's again, not like you have to be the perfect partner in your couple. You have to be the good enough partner. You want to make sure you're there at least 30% of the time to meet those needs. It's just something I wanted to mention. But so as an adult, really what this boils down to is, how do you reach out? I'll go ahead and say that I have had some life-changing experiences in the past 6 months that have really awakened my first dimension need for safety and security. And I've started working with an old colleague, therapist, trainer, supervisor of mine, experienced professional that I feel comfortable working with about these deep infant attachment issues. And our first session together, when we started this therapy a few months ago, she asked me at the end of the first session, how do you reach out? And I didn't get it. My first response is like, what the fuck are you talking about? And in my mind, I was like, I don't reach out. And there was another part of me that was like so triggered by this that I want, my toddler wanted to just storm out of the room, like, fuck you. Why are you even asking me that? And so it's just and I think maybe a lot of us as men, we feel like we can go and do it on our own. We don't need to connect for safety. We're men, we can create our own safety. And for me, at least, I've had that attitude, but it's not because I am particularly good at creating my own safety. It's actually, I'm really shitty at it. And the story I've developed in my head is that I don't need anybody else. So you ask me to reach out, I get kind of averse to that. And through our therapy, I'm learning, one of the things I'm learning is how to reach out and connect. And so that's the question I would ask you. If you really want to think about this in a relational perspective, how do you connect for safety and security? How do you create those connections with other people that create a sense of safety and security and allow you to then internalize that feeling so that you can self-regulate instead of having to always co-regulate? But you start with co-regulation. It's not something you just figure out on your own. And so my whole point on making this a relational perspective for this model is because I believe it's a developmental model at its base, and we develop in connection with other people. We don't develop on our own. We're not just babies spit out into the world and learn to make it on our own. We develop through connection and through relationship. And that's why it's not like relationship fits into the second dimension. It's not like it fits into the fourth dimension. It fits into all the dimensions. And that is, I think, that if I could impress one thing on everybody with this process, what I think was really critically missing from the 8 circuit model is that we develop in relationship, and it's through relationship. The saying in my Gestalt training is that when we're hurt in relationship, we need to heal in relationship. And since we develop in relationship, that's where the hurts are going to happen, and that's where the healing doesn't necessarily have to happen. We can do our own personal work on our own, but in my opinion, the really deep work, the most effective work, involves relationship. And so with all that said, I'm going to check out here, and next episode will be on the second dimension, which involves a lot more regulation theory and some other things we'll go into. So we'll talk to you then.